Well, thanks very much for joining us. We're delighted to be joined by Scottish Government Fair Work Policy and Delivery team. We've got two Scottish Government colleagues with us today, Rosie Whelan, who's the team lead and will do the presentation today, and Rory Hayes, who's the Senior Policy Officer and will help out with the Q&A. But before we start, I'm going to introduce my SCVO colleague, Caroline Christie, and she's going to give a short overview of some SCVO services that could help those who are employers and have an interest in fair work.
Hi, thanks, Shelley. Thanks again to Rosie and Rory for joining us today, and thank you to you also for joining us. So as Shelley said, we're recording the session. If you need to turn on the captions, if you just go to the more, the three little dots in the more, and you'll be able to turn on the captions. And also feel free following this session to share the link to the recording with your colleagues and your networks. So just a quick bit about SCVO. So we're the membership body for the voluntary sector in Scotland, and we advocate on behalf of our members and the wider sector. So we organise events such as this event today to help keep you informed, and we also deliver services to help you run your organisations. So for support on fair work and other things, you can contact our HR service. For up-to-date news and information about fair work and lots of other things, check out our website and our monthly news publication, TFN. We also run other services to help you with the day-to-day, so payroll, IT, recruitment, and we also have an events and training programme. So we'll share links to all these things along with the recording following this session. I'll pass back to Shelley. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. And I think we'll get going with the presentation. So if we can share the slides, and then Rosie, as I said, is the team lead for the Scottish Government Fair Work Policy and Delivery team. Just making sure I get that right there.
Thank you, Shelley. Lorna, can I just check, did the slides come through?
Yes, they did, and I'm just about to share them.
You've got them. That's grand. So while Lorna's uploading the slides, let me just reintroduce ourselves. So I'm Rosie Whelan, and as Shelley said, I'm the team leader for the Fair Work Policy and Delivery team. Rory from my team is on this call, but he's having some technical problems, and we can't hear him, and we can't see him at the moment, but he is in the background, so hopefully he manages to resolve that before we get to the Q&A. But I'll deliver the presentation, which is going to flash in front of you as I speak this morning. We will share a copy of that at the end of the session, along with a response to any particular questions that you might ask. So we can get that out to you in due course. So without further ado, let me talk you through Fair Work and Fair Work First. Some of you hopefully are pretty familiar with this already. We ran a series of webinars last year, and we did have quite a few third sector organisations participate in those. So if you were one of those, thank you very much for joining us then and for coming back to hear more and to get an update on where we are. So let's just move on to the first slide, please, Lorna. So this first slide that's going to come up is just an illustration to remind us of the dimensions of fair work. So the Scottish Government has been committed to fair work since about 2015 and established the Fair Work Convention, who the convention is a group of academics, of employers and of trade unions who come together and they challenge Scottish Government, they support Scottish Government in its fair work policy. And the Fair Work Convention developed the Fair Work framework and identified the 5 dimensions that are on this screen. So respect, security, opportunity, fulfilment and effective voice. And those dimensions of fair work underpin our whole fair work approach in Scotland. And Scottish Government shares the ambition of the Fair Work Convention for Scotland to be a leading fair work nation by 2025. Now, that's not very far away, and by no means do we expect to have it all cracked by then. Fair work is an evolving agenda. It's very much a journey, but that is what the ambition is, and the kind of background to that, what that ambition would look like is set out on this slide. So the next slide, again, it's just a wee series of illustrations that try to capture the prominence and the very high profile that fair work has in Scotland. And it is part of our national performance framework. So that's the framework that the government uses to monitor and measure progress on its key priorities for Scotland. So you'll see that there are two of the daisy wheels circled, the brown one at the bottom, which talks very much about thriving and innovative businesses, quality jobs and fair work for everyone. And also tackling poverty by sharing opportunities, wealth and power more equally. Those are the main two indicators in the framework that support fair work. And there are wee snippets here from key documents that have been published. So our Fair Work Action Plan was refreshed the year before last, and that again, that drives everything that we do on fair work. We've got our 10-year national economic strategy, and fair work is a key pillar within that. And we've got an anti-racist employment strategy, Fair Work, Fair Scotland for All. The Fair Work Action Plan incorporates our previous gender pay gap action plan and our disability employment action plan. These two were previously separate action plans, but we've incorporated them into the Fair Work Action Plan. And the actions from the anti-racist employment strategy are also incorporated within the action plan. So very much a holistic action plan spanning the whole range of interests in fair work to drive forward progress. Thanks, Lorna. Next slide, please. Not coming. Here we go. So Fair Work First is probably the thing that exercises most of our stakeholders around fair work. So Fair Work First is I'll call it a mechanism. It's an approach that we apply across the funding that Scottish Government issues to other organisations. Now, whether that is grants, public sector grants, whether it's to do with procurement, so contracts that are delivered through procured services, or other funding mechanisms like the funding that goes to our public bodies, for example. And ministers have been very clear. Fair Work First was introduced first in 2019, and ministers have been clear from the outset that they want to use all of the levers available to them to drive fair work practices across the labour market in Scotland. And because the Scottish Government does not have control over employment and industrial relations legislation, Fair Work First is the most effective tool that we do have. So we award a lot of money to organisations, we award a lot of contracts, and ministers have said we will apply fair work principles to those funding streams. And in front of you here, you will see the 7 principles of Fair Work First. And again, you should be familiar, if you've received grants from Scottish Government or from other public sector organisations over recent years, they should all be fairly familiar to you. So our practice is that up until July of last year, any grant recipient or anyone delivering a contract was asked to commit to adopting these Fair Work First principles. and that would have been reflected in grant award letters that organisations have received. Since July 2023, we introduced more stringent conditions around the first two. You'll see here that payment of the at least the real living wage and the effective voice principle are both asterisked. So both of these principles became conditions of public sector grants. Now they're not relevant for, they're not conditions of procurement. They're purely relating to public sector grants, which is probably, again, an interest for yourselves. Those two are much more stringent conditions of accessing the grant, and the other 5 principles are still an ask. We still ask and encourage grant recipients to work towards delivering these other 5. And I'll come back onto the 2 conditions just in a wee second. So again, you should be quite familiar with some of this, and just always important to remember that the conditionality applies only to those 2, the living wage and the effective voice principles at this point in time. Can I have the next slide up, please, Lorna? So where are we on implementing the conditionality? So as I said, the more stringent conditionality for real living wage and effective voice is effective from the 1st of July last year. And those 2 conditions must be demonstrated by a grant recipient or a grant applicant before they can actually access a public sector grant. Our Fair Work First guidance explains the evidence requirements for you to be able to demonstrate to your funder that you're meeting those conditions. In relation to the real living wage, the condition applies just as it's set out here. All staff who are directly employed by the grant recipient and work in Scotland must be paid at least the real living wage. And that means all directly employed staff, aged 16 and over, including apprentices. Also included are all workers who are directly engaged in the delivery of the funded activity, even those that are not direct employees of your organisation, such as subcontractors or agency staff. Again, all workers aged 16 and over and including apprentices who are based anywhere in the UK, not just those working in Scotland. So if you were bringing workers in from somewhere else outside the organisation, then that particular element would also be relevant. And for effective voice, the condition is that all organisations who have a workforce must be able to demonstrate that all workers employed within that organisation have access to effective voice channels, including agency workers. Next slide, please, Lorna. So again, if you have previously received a grant from Scottish Government, you will be familiar with your grant offer letter. So that is a standard letter that is used for the award of grants right across Scottish Government. So any organisation that's getting a grant gets the same grant offer letter. The grant offer letter has been updated to reflect the more stringent conditionality, particularly at clause 5. So if you have a grant offer letter with the conditionality in it, that's where it will be. If you're looking forward at grants that you may be applying for the new financial year, again, clause 5 is where you would find references to the conditions for living wage and effective voice. And that text can only be amended with agreement of the Scottish Government Legal Department, and it would be amended in cases where an exception to meeting the real living wage condition in full has been approved by the funder. And when I talk about the funder, I mean the particular bit of Scottish Government or a public body that's awarding the grant. And just because there is added focus on the real living wage and effective voice principles, that doesn't mean that we take our eye off the ball in relation to the other 5 Fair Work First principles, but they are not conditions. As I mentioned before, grant recipients are encouraged to commit to working towards those other 5 principles. And we would expect milestones to be set out in the grant offer letter in Schedule 1, and these should be agreed between the funder and the grant recipient, and they should set out the Fair Work commitments that the grant recipient is committing to, and the milestones for working towards these. And it's very much for individual grant makers or funders to monitor the delivery of Fair Work First in grants, and that's done as part of their wider grant management arrangements. So you'll be aware again, if you're familiar with the grant offer letter, that there are a number of conditions in grant offer letters, not just for fair work. So it's for the funders and the grant recipients to work together to monitor the delivery of those and make sure requirements are met. So the very same rule applies for Fair Work First principles. Next slide, please, Lorna. Since the new condition was introduced, the new conditions were introduced in July last year, we have become aware of a number of challenges that some stakeholders have highlighted. And probably the main one that has been highlighted is the affordability of paying the real living wage to 16 and 17-year-old workers and apprentices. So it's important to know and always to remember that the Fair Work First approach and the conditionality measures include the scope for a potential grant recipient who can genuinely not afford to meet that condition, either for part of their workforce or for all of their workforce, to request an exception to meeting the real living wage condition. So if affordability is an issue, then you can, as a grant applicant, request an exception to meeting the real living wage condition in full. There is a template for doing that, and it sits on our Fair Work or Scottish Government website. I should say there is, at the end page of this presentation, there are a number of links, and one of those links will take you to our Fair Work First guidance and resources that sit alongside that, and the template for requesting an exception can be found there as well. So we know that's an issue. There is a way of managing that for genuine reasons that grant recipients can request in order to be able to access a grant. But to really inform ministers' thinking on this issue going forward, we are in the process of developing a business regulatory impact assessment, a BRIA, and that will be carried out in the coming weeks on the living wage and the effective voice conditions. And ministers will use the BRIA findings to consider our policy on these areas going forward. We are hoping to get the BRIA issued. Well, there's going to be an online survey, and we're hoping to get that issued probably next week. We're also running a series of face-to-face interviews with a range of stakeholders across the public, private and third sectors, and SCVO have very kindly given us a list of potential participants in there, and we're reaching out to some of those at the moment. And as I say, the findings from the BRIA will very much influence ministers' decisions going forward around the inclusion of the real living wage conditionality for apprentices and 16 to 17-year-old workers. The next point isn't relevant for you, but it might just be of interest, useful to know. So we have agreed a streamlined administration process for local government because they receive a huge volume, and every individual local authority receives a large volume of grants from the Scottish Government, and if they were to request an exception for their organisation, it would be a hugely disproportionate administrative burden to expect them to do that for every single grant, because their case for requesting an exception would be pretty much the same in every case. So we've agreed a process, a streamlined process for them, whereby an authority wishing to request an exception to paying the real living wage need only submit one request for an exception, and that is considered by our team on behalf of Scottish Government grants. The final point, again, perhaps not so relevant for third sector organisations as for private sector and public sector. So we know that some trade unions are refusing to sign the verification statement for a local authority. They feel that their effective voice mechanisms are not as strong as they should be. Ministers have responded to that issue and discussed with the relevant unions, and our position is, so some of these union issues relate to industrial disputes that are going on in organisations, and ministers are very clear that industrial disputes are very much separate from the Fair Work principles, and they shouldn't be conflated, and one shouldn't get in the way of the other happening. So not really relevant for you, but again, we just want to be open and share the information and the challenges with you at this stage. Can I have the next slide, please, Lorna? So there is guidance on the use of limited exceptions, and again, a link at the end of the slide deck will take you to that if you haven't already seen it. So funders, and that may be different bits of Scottish Government, it could be a public body, but they can apply a limited exception to meeting the real living wage condition where there is a genuine affordability issue. I should say that there is no exception to meeting the effective voice condition. That needs to be met. It's a very flexible condition. There are various examples of what effective voice can look like. And we're very much aware that not all organised recognise or have a presence of a trade union within them, and we do not stipulate anywhere that trade union recognition is mandatory. It's to be an appropriate mechanism for effective voice. So we know that for smaller organisations, there are other options to providing voice, and there are a range of options set out in our Fair Work First guidance to illustrate what that can be. But again, not prescriptive at all. So if your organisation had real concerns about the affordability of meeting that real living wage condition in your organisation, you can request a limited exception, and that would need to be considered by a senior authorising or accountable officer of the funder. So that wouldn't be the Fair Work bit of Scottish Government. If you're getting, if you were getting a grant from, say, a bit of social justice, it would be for those teams to consider your case for affordability. And I mentioned already, we've got the streamlined approach for Scottish Government grants to local authorities that we've got in place at the moment. A limited exception, so if you felt you needed a limited exception to meeting that real living wage condition, it shouldn't automatically be, the default shouldn't be that you need it for the whole organisation. Our expectation is that it should be considered in the first instance for targeted parts of the workforce, and whilst you're continuing to be required to pay at least the real living wage for the rest of the workforce. But again, support and guidance is available on these issues that I've talked through today. And the template for requesting an exception is there if you need to use it. Can I have the next slide, please, Lorna? So next steps in our implementation journey. So I mentioned that we're doing a BRIA, And do be reassured that that covers the third sector as well as private and public sectors. So we really want to get views on the impact of having to meet the Fair Work conditionality on real living wage and effective voice. Whether or not you are in receipt of a grant with those conditions in it. So if you are, what has the impact been? If you are considering applying for a grant next year, what do you think those impacts would be? And we will get a copy of the online survey to you. We'll ask SCVO and other ACOSVO and Third Sector Interface and any other communication channels we have access to get the survey out to you. And just a few will be included in the face-to-face interviews. We're also going to be carrying out a full evaluation of the impact of the Fair Work First policy since it started in 2019. We're hoping to get that underway during the next financial year. And we'll use the findings to inform the focus for our next phases of conditionality. So the Butte House Agreement and the National Strategy for Economic Transformation don't stop at the Fair Work First approach that we have at the moment. So with the most recent change was the new conditionality. The Butte House and NSET have given us another 2 challenges to consider to explore the options to develop conditions for the other 5 Fair Work principles. So those 5 that still remain an ask and an encourage, we've to consider whether we can make those more stringent conditions as well. And also to explore if we can and how we might extend Fair Work conditionality to other forms of Scottish Government support, such as licensing, consents, and anything else that is there. We haven't started scoping out that work yet, but that would be the next phases, and those phases will be informed by the evaluation. So the next slide, Lorna, if you bring that up, you will see, I hope, links to various documents. So the refreshed Fair Work Action Plan, our Fair Work First guidance, and I should stress that this is under review to bring it up to date with the changes around the July 2023 conditionality, and to make clearer some of the areas that some stakeholders are fed back are a bit confusing, like the evidence requirements, the monitoring requirements. The supporting documents for Fair Work First guidance, so that's where you'll get the template if you needed to request an exception. And our Fair Work employer support tool is still available, and the CIPD Fair Work resource is still available. So I would encourage you to watch out for the Fair Work First guidance when it comes, hopefully not too far off. Again, once it's published, we'll get a link out through our communication channels so you can get it at first hand. And if you have time to give a wee bit of attention to the areas that are relevant for you, that would be good. So that's all by way of presentation. We've got some time for some question and answer. I'm hoping Rory has a voice now that we can hear him. I'm not sure that he has. I certainly can't see him. So I will do my best to answer any questions that you have. We might need to take some away and give it a wee bit of thought. I should have a colleague here from the third sector team. I'm not sure if he's on or not.
Yes, yes,
He is. That's grand.
Philip Caravan's here.
Great. Thanks, Philip, for joining. So if there are any more general questions that come up just about sectoral issues, it would be more for Philip than us.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, Rosie, and thanks also for the update on the next steps. That's interesting to hear. And we do have a question that came in advance, and that's from Kerry from Cove Park. So I'll invite Kerry to come in now and ask that question.
Hi, I'm Kerry. I'm at Cove Park. We're an artist residency just at the very start of Argyll. We've been working quite intensely on our Fair Work plan and have made lots of really good progress, but we've been finding the issues around gender pay quite difficult, and the gender pay gap, specifically with the kind of underlying problems around childcare provision and shared parental leave, which we find really difficult as a small underfunded organisation to effectively tackle. And I was just really wondering if there's anything else that's happening at government level that might be able to assist, specifically childcare provision in rural areas, and if there is expected to be changes to shared parental leave that would impact that, because at the moment the funding that's available, you know, the 2 weeks that non-birthing parents get isn't really significant and doesn't really impact. So we're just really keen to know if there's any other support that's expected.
Hi, Kerry. Thanks for your question. So I'm not responsible for childcare in Scotland. I'm not responsible for parental leave or anything like that. So I can't answer that, but we can go away and try and get an answer for you. What I can say is that, just to remind you from what I said earlier, that tackling the gender pay gap is one of our 5 non-mandatory principles, if you like. So living wage and effective voice are the requirements. So these are the stringent conditions. And you are asked to work towards meeting the gender pay gap. So it's good to hear that you are trying to do something to improve things. And I appreciate you're finding difficulty in that. Again, I'm not responsible for flexible working in any way, but there is a team in our wider Fair Work unit that is. So we recognise that tackling the gender pay gap, there are many issues and practices that influence, that drive that, and inflexible working practice is one of them. And that's why a couple of years ago, we introduced the flexible working principle in our set of Fair Work First principles. So that is a good step, but we do recognise it only applies to organisations that are receiving grant funding and delivering contracts. It's not part of the national strategy for childcare. So I am not aware firsthand of anything else that's happening across government, particularly in the areas that you're concerned about. So if you don't mind, we will take the questions away. I know Rory's noting the questions in the background, and we'll come back to you with something on that. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry and Rosie. And we've got quite a few questions in the chat, so I think I'll answer a couple of them before I invite anyone to raise their hand. And the first one is from Sheila from Link. She says, are you concerned about the unintended consequences of payment of the Scottish living wage for apprentices and 16 to 17-year-olds? That less apprentices and young people in training programmes may be taken on by organisations. And I think perhaps from the talk, maybe there are a few concerns around that when you talked about possible exemptions in that area. But over to you, Rosie.
So that is a concern that's coming through from stakeholders. Yep. And that's partly why we're doing the BRIA, to understand what those concerns are. We want to hear from employers directly what the impact would be. So yes, it is a concern. And I wouldn't preempt what's going to come through the BRIA, but there has been quite a lot of concern raised from a number of stakeholders around the apprenticeship, the inclusion of apprentices, both from employers and from trade bodies. And some of the issues, resonate with that question, that employers will stop recruiting apprentices. If they have to pay them the real living wage, they won't be able to take as many on, and therefore you're cutting off, career pathways. So that's why we're doing the BRIA, to really understand what the impact of that particular condition would be. there will be a report published on the outcome of the BRIA in due course.
Thanks, Rosie. Great if you could keep us informed in that and we can keep people up to date when that comes out. The next question is from Susan. She hasn't shared her organisation, but I think this might be one for both yourself and Philip. It says, how is government policy and action going to support fair work, considering funding is being cut, funding periods are being shortened, and via procurement there is no built-in uplifts, making it difficult to provide security and for some organisations to pay the living wage. And as you know, that's something that SCVO have been talking about for some time. I think more and more organisations are raising these similar concerns.
So I think it probably is for Philip more to answer that one. Yes, budgets are tighter than they've ever been. Our Cabinet Secretary for Fair Work has made the comment that the budget is tighter than it has been since devolution this year. So we're very much aware of that. In relation to fair work, so again, the exception is there if there are issues around affordability. And ministers will review. So we will update ministers. We've yet to work out our timing for that, but we will update ministers around the volume and the scope of exceptions that have been made in this financial year, to give them a sense of how that really is impacting. But I suppose just from the benefits of fair work perspective, so mindful and not diminishing in any way the challenges around budgets, but fair work, there is pretty strong evidence that indicates that fair work can help employers in a number of ways. It's, it kind of stands to reason. If you treat your workers well, if you pay them well, your workers tend to be more loyal, they tend to be more productive, they tend to want to stay with the employer, and therefore that, the continuity of and the opportunity to build staff, to build skilled workforce, to keep your staff, and to avoid the churn, the ongoing recruitment of staff. Fair Work can help with that in terms of budget impacts and both the cost of recruitment, but the drain on staff as well. But maybe Philip can come in on the funding for third sector issue.
Thanks, Rosie, and morning, everyone. So just picking up the point from the question around funding periods. So we're obviously aware that multi-year funding is very, very high up in everyone's kind of priority list when it comes to funding, and we understand the implications of, this year-to-year funding arrangements. I understand, how that impacts sustainability and ability to be able to plan ahead. It is probably no surprise to a lot of folks on the call today, particularly those from the third sector, that there is a slight gap in terms of how we collate all the information and all the grants that go out from Scottish Government to all the third sector in particular. So that not capturing all of that under the public bodies, just talking about third sector. So at the moment, what we've actually done and what we're doing in Scottish Government is a DG wide, so across all policy areas, all grant areas in the Scottish Government, and in collaboration with our Exchequer colleagues. And it's essentially a whole new grant tracking system that we're setting up for Scottish Government. And it's in order for us to assess how many single year grants we have, or multi-year funding arrangements we have, we need to ask those questions first in terms of an SG-wide approach. That will then allow us to assess the impact of how many policy areas and grant managers will need to consider increasing their single-year grants to multi-year grants where applicable. So that's currently on the go at the moment. So this is the first time that this has essentially been done. So there's a whole team, myself leading that team, and I've got a few other colleagues in the third sector unit. So we're actually the first kind of team to hit on the fair funding elements of this. So we are progressing that as far as we can at the moment. So I understand the question in terms of that's, you know, the funding periods, and I'm not aware of them being shortened, but I'm aware of obviously there's that year-on-year cycle which isn't compatible. The other question about funding being cut, I think, as Rosie said, I think we're all facing that same implication. And I understand that it's difficult for us to try and encourage and try and get everyone to pay that real living wage whenever potentially grants are being cut and been reduced over the years. So we are looking at the moment about the conditionality around the grant offer letters. There's nothing has been confirmed yet, but what we're trying to do is essentially see if there's any flexibility then if there is reduction in grant payments, the grants can be freed up to make sure employers can meet those real living costs, real living wage costs to completely cover core funding. And we identify core funding as, you know, your salary, pay, utility bills, the kind of infrastructural operational costs that we would associate that with core funding. So there is work underway at the moment with our SJLD, our legal colleagues that Rosie highlighted earlier, to essentially review that condition in particular, and see whether or not there is any way we can, you know, kind of review that and make that a bit more open. So that's under review at the moment. We will be going out to the sector, particularly those that we fund. And just to be clear, we're only doing this for the grantees and organisations that the Scottish Government fund. We've no control over other independent funders, so it's just us that have to manage this. If other funders want to also get on board with this, that'd be great. We have already reached out to them and obviously engaged with them about current practices, but we've got no kind of governance over that side of things. So we will be going out to the folks that we've got financial relationships with for third sector in due course, with a bit of a progress update in terms of what's happening over the next year. As we all know, this is a commitment that First Minister made at the gathering that SCVO hosted this year, about, you know, prompt notification of funding, multi-year funding, review of conditions, and in general review of the internal grant making processes for the Scottish Government holds at the moment. So all of that has been picked up. It's not going to happen, not going to be fixed all overnight. So it's just a bit of kind of have to work through each phase of that. But we'll be able to provide updates, and I'm sure colleagues at SCVO will hopefully help us share that information as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be delighted to help with that. Thanks for that. Thanks for that update, and I'll maybe follow up with you on some of that as well. Next, we have a question from Odine Imaginate. She said, I wonder how union recognition works for cultural organisations. Is it about signposting staff to workers' unions, engaging with unions directly, attending meetings? What are the practical steps for union recognition for our staff? So I think that would be one for you, Rosie, if you can offer that.
Thanks, Shelley. And Odine, I think it is a Fair Work question. I'm no expert on unions. We've got another team that deals with that. What would it look like for culture? It could look like a number of things, I guess. And again, I would point you to our Fair Work First guidance, where there are various examples of what effective voice would look like. So Odine, are you needing more than that?
No, that's okay. I'll look at the document and see if I can find some examples. Thanks very much.
If you don't, then do come back to us, and I can direct you to Ruth in our unit who leads on the union engagement side. Thank you.
Okay, next we've got a question from Susan, and it's about the exemptions. So she asks, when you say exemption, is this for the local authority to get an exemption so that they can give grants to third sector organisations that cannot meet the requirements? Would this be a process for any organisation that administers grants on behalf of the government? So I think she's just asking who is to seek that exemption there.
So if so whoever the funder is, well, a funder and a potential grant recipient. So the potential grant recipient is the organisation that has to request an and it's not an exemption. Nobody is exempt from Fair Work First. There is just, you get an exception to this part of it. So if your organisation needed an exception from paying the real living wage in relation to a grant from a public sector organisation, so whether that is Creative Scotland giving you a grant or Scottish Government, so if you needed the exception, you would discuss that with whoever your funder is. They would suggest perhaps that you complete the exception template and you submit that to the funder, and the funder considers whether it is relevant. Now, the template asks for you have to explain why, to which groups of workers you need the exception, why, what the numbers are like, what the cost would be, and how what action you would take to work towards meeting that condition in future funding rounds. And that would be submitted to the funder. So say it was going to Creative Scotland or it could be a local authority. It's for them to determine whether an exception is relevant in each case. Does that answer the question?
No, not really.
Okay.
I work at the Alliance, and we get a fund from the Scottish Government that we administer on behalf of the Scottish Government.
All right, okay.
So we be the funder, but we're not public sector, we're a third sector
That's
organisation.
okay.
So does that apply to us?
It does.
Right, so everybody that we give a grant to would have to go through that process?
Yes.
Thanks for that, for coming in there, Susan. So I hope that's been helpful. Next, a bit of an alarming question from Jamie Dunlop. Jamie says, I note that grant offer letters have recently included a clause about grant funds not paying for sick pay, maternity pay, etc. Thinking about fair work in an increasingly challenging environment, for Scottish Government to ask organisations to comply with the real living wage and effective voice, etc., and then not allowing employers to support their contractual obligations, is there scope to review this in light of creating a fair workforce? So I would guess that's one for both Rosie and Philip there.
So it's more a funding issue than it is a fair work issue, but I get what the connection is. So I'm going to let Philip come in first, I think. And I don't even know if it is for Philip because it's a general grant issue. It's not a third sector grant issue. It applies to all grants.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. It's not just targeted at third sector, it's for everyone that falls under this. So this is one of the conditions that I'd mentioned earlier that we are, we're getting a bit of I suppose data on and get information from the third sector itself about how the implications of that, and what Jamie has set out there is, that we're hearing that from a lot of organizations across the sector. So this is the reason why it's now been put on our radar to try and fix that problem. So that condition, I think don't think off the top of my head, but I think it's 2.7 or something like that in the grant offer letter, but it more or less sets out that, the grant won't cover statutory obligations such as sick pay, maternity cover, etc. So what was currently on trail now, what our plan is to review that condition with our legal colleagues and with finance colleagues and Exchequer as well, to see what the scope is to not necessarily get rid of that condition, but to make it a bit more flexible, so that actually if there is an element of the grant funding that can be used to support those costs. There was previously, I think we had advice that, why we can't completely take it out is that we don't want any confusion, I suppose, around what that funding's for, so that if Scottish Government funding technically covered any of those statutory employment costs, that there's no confusion that the Scottish Government is the employer, where it's a bit of a legal formatting and the kind of technicalities is in the legal territory. So that's what we're trying to kind of review, and it might just be that we can put more of an explicit condition in there to set out that we are absolutely not the employer, or the funder is absolutely not the employer. But that it's not for me or for Rosie's to decide that one. I got is more of a legal update, but that is one of the parts that we're looking into at the moment. So if we get any kind of headway on that, we'll be able to update the third sector and obviously SVO as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Philip. And I know some colleagues in SCVO have previously mentioned that, so I'll follow up with them as well on what their thoughts are around that. Katie Barnwell has said, you mentioned the guidance is under review, including monitoring requirements. What specifically is being looked at? That's one for you, Rosie.
For monitoring requirements. Yep.
Okay. Including
Okay.
monitoring requirements. Yeah, I think she's just interested in what part of the guidance is being reviewed.
Lots of bits. Lots of bits are being reviewed, but there will be to make it easy for the reader, there will be a page setting out where the important updates are. So the evidence requirements is being updated, some clarification around some of the effective voice stuff, the detail of the age groups and the geographical scope for the inclusion, so which workers are in scope for the conditionality and which aren't. So they're the kind of main bits that are being updated. But as I say, there'll be a wee table attached to or sitting alongside the link to the updated guidance, setting out where the main updates are.
Thanks, Rosie. We've got one I think is directed at Philip again from Katrina Brown. So she said on the question around tight budgets, the issue is not just that budgets are tight, but also the increasing short-term and short notice nature of funding significantly increases porosity. Specifically speaking about the culture sector, could this issue be fed back? Oh, okay. What do you think, Philip? And I know that short notice is something that SCVO are working on quite a bit just now, because obviously we're coming to the end of the financial year, and this is a period where a lot of organisations struggle with not knowing, what funding they're going to get, poor communication, and then often, not paid on time either. And I'll maybe mention something about some work we're doing on that at the end, but for now I'll pass that over to Philip.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that we're very aware of at the moment, and actually it's an issue that we are actually falling foul of as well. So so our budget stuff in the Scottish Government hasn't been completed yet either. So we don't have those final figures on our sides, which is obviously it impacts the delay in us getting that notification out to third sector. So it's not as if we've got everything sitting ready to go. We're in a position where we've got a percentage that we know we're up, but we don't have the actual final figures. So that's why we can't get anything out third sector. It is an issue and that we know of. It's just something that we're looking into in the more wider review of the internal grant making processes. So that multi-year funding, once we try to kind of mitigate that and try and rectify that as far as possible, that short notification should be mitigated throughout that. So we're not having to update and inform third sector organizations, year on year at the same point. So if we had that grant offer for 2 or 3 years, they'd know exactly what they're getting for each of those financial years. So the multi-year should hopefully mitigate all of that. So it's very much on the radar. So yeah, it's absolutely been fed back, and it's something that, again, FM has made quite clear for us to try and pick up as well.
Yes, but we have had commitments to multi-year for quite some time. So in the meantime, while we don't have multi-year, it would be nice to at least have timely notifications and payments, because who knows how long we might wait for multi-year. Not to be too negative, but I think for about 4 years we've had a commitment to multi-year and it still hasn't actually happened yet. So one for Rosie, and I think this might be the last one that we have time for. The other questions we will send to Rosie and her team, and we'll get written answers back and we'll send them to the entire group. So please don't worry if we haven't gotten to your question. But this might be a good one to finish on, and it's how do we get involved in the BRIA? And that's from Susan from the Alliance.
Thanks for your question, Susan. So as I mentioned, the BRIA, so that's Business Regulatory Impact Assessment, comprises two strands of activity. One is an online survey, and as I said, once we've got the survey ready for issue, and that should be within the next, hopefully by the end of next week, we will we'll approach SCVO, a COSVO, third sector interface. We will ask Philip for any other channels that we might use for third sector, and we'll get the link out. So be reassured, we'll reach as wide as we can to get the online survey out so that you can complete it. The other strand of work is a small series of online interviews with stakeholders. So we've asked SCVO, we've got some local authority, we've got private business, we've got social enterprise in there. So we've got a selection of organisations to interview, to hear their thoughts on the impact on their business, either real or what they might expect were they to apply for a grant. So from the list that SCVO have provided, we have identified a few who we've reached out to, and we've got some dates, either dates in the calendars. Our interviews start on Thursday this week, and they will run until we conclude those. So do please take the chance to do the online survey when it lands with you.
Thanks, Rosie, and we'll be sure to include anything that's been mentioned in the webinar when it comes through with everybody who's registered. And I'll maybe just finish by saying that SCVO also have a survey coming up on timely communication and payments. So my colleague Jason is leading on that, and it's really to start to collect evidence on if there has been any improvement or if people, you know, are continuing to face the same issues. I think there's been a commitment that organisations would have their confirmation by I think the date is the 31st of March. Jason's not here, so I can't check with him. SCVO have actually asked for confirmations, you know, significantly in advance of that date, because obviously that's cutting it pretty fine for the next financial year. But in the meantime, I'll share, when I share everything else, the details of Jason's survey, and it'd be great if some people could take part in that. And I think our plan is to run that this year and next year to see, you know, are there actually been improvements in this area? Because of course it's so relevant to fair work and job security for everybody that all of our organisations employ. So thank you very much to Rosie and Philip and Rory for joining us today. It sounds like we're going to have quite a lot of resources and other things to send out after the session, which is great, and hopefully will help people to understand their Fair Work First criteria even more. And I think we'll also have a stronger idea of what might be next for Fair Work. So it's good to be a bit ahead of the game for that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And I should say, Shelley, just to be clear, so the work we're going to do on these next two phases of Fair Work, it's purely exploratory work to first of all, to explore whether it's feasible to do it, what would be the impacts of doing it. So please don't, it's not a fait accompli. There's a lot of exploratory work to do before we get to that. I just don't want to set hairs running.
Yeah, it's round the corner. Yes, no, we definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to go into it before we get anywhere near that. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.